Hello everyone, and do you want to learn a powerful opening weapon that only happens once every 220 games and will be a massive surprise to all of your opponents? If you do, then let me introduce you to Bxb4, the Polish opening. So first, I'll talk about all the main ideas of this move as well as the golden setup that you want to try and achieve, and then I will get into the actual theory. So the first idea of playing pawn to b4 is actually not about the pawn at all, but rather the diagonal that it has now opened up. And this bishop will go to b2 in every single variation, either on the next move or the third move, and when it goes to b2, it will be patrolling this entire diagonal. That's when it's called a fianchetto, and that bishop is going to be very strong for the whole game. Secondly, the actual b-pawn. So what we're doing here by advancing it 2 squares, not 1 but 2, is we're first controlling a lot of queenside space in black's territory, and as I will show you in the main setup, we often have ideas of going c4 and d4 in the future to try and grab a lot of queenside space and really submerge black over there. We're also often going to sacrifice it, as in some gambits as well as the main line, as well as also push it up to b5 sometimes to really clamp down on the queen side and make this knight's natural development really annoying to accomplish. And then there's also the psychological aspect of playing an opening like this. First off, your opponent is almost never going to see this. I looked at the stats. This opening only happens once every 220 games, so if you're playing it, you can be pretty sure you have quite literally hundreds of times more experience in it than black does. And also, because you are playing an opening that your opponent probably knows is not dubious, but is definitely not the best objectively, they might think that they have to get an advantage, and they should get an advantage. I have been guilty of this myself. And that can often lead to them making very bad decisions, trying to get an advantage, which will ultimately lead to their failure. So, the main setup that you want to get here, and I'll just do it by looking at, or making this knight move back and forth, just nonsense moves, is first moving this bishop to b2, getting on the long diagonal, and then playing pawn to c4, really controlling all this queenside space, as well as controlling the very important d5 square to make a potential pawn to d5 move more annoying for them to make. Then pawn to e3 here, defend this pawn as well as open up your bishop, and these two moves can usually be played in any order. Then pawn to a3, defending this pawn, usually on move 5 or 6 or above. That's around the point where you never want to gambit this pawn anymore, and it's probably better to just defend it with your own pawn or push it up to b5. Then this knight, develop it to c3. It can also go to d2 in some situations as well. Then this knight will always go to f3. This bishop here will always go to e2. Then simply castle, get nice and solid. And then this queen here usually will go to c2. Usually, obviously, b6, a4. There's situations where all these moves are useful, but most of the time, c2 will be the move for you. And then in the future, you want to try and get a d4 break, really control the center, defend it by your pawn. And if you can get a position like this, you will have a great time. And with only a few exceptions, this setup is what you'll be going for once again every single time. So let's start to get into the actual theory after Bxb4. Black has a lot of options here, and I'll talk about all of them, but first I'll look at the most popular and most important one, pawn to e5. With this move, they are immediately opening up their bishop to see this pawn, and if they do this, then we simply want to play bishop to b2 here. Attack this guy, and if they capture, we're going to capture here, and this is the main line, the position where black has the apparently best chances here. I will get more into this in just a moment, but first I want to look at if they do not end up capturing this pawn. First, knight to c6 is a very common move at beginner level because it defends the pawn as well as attacks this guy, but this just does not work because we push up to b5, and this is a blind spot for a lot of people because b4 and b5 so early is just so irregular, and we're simply going to win the pawn on e5 because their knight can no longer defend it. If they try knight to d4, then we have a very nice pawn to e3, both attacking the knight to get it out of the way as well as defending the pawn with our bishop. Knight will move, then we simply capture. We're up a pawn on move 4, you are welcome. So, knight to c6, because that is a pretty bad move. Their other responses include pawn to d6. This is the Czech defense and is not a bad option for them. However, now their bishop is blocked in, and their bishop doesn't even see this guy anymore, and because of that, we have a pretty easy game here. Just pawn to e3, then pawn to c4. Once again, you can go in pretty much either order here, then move the knight out. Pawn a3. Once again, this is pretty much all I showed in the main setup that we have here. If they ever play pawn to a5, which is the best move here according to the engine, you never, and I mean never, never want to trade here. This is pretty much always going to be bad. Instead, you want to push up to b5, take more queenside space, hinder this knight's development, and after something like bishop to e6, knight to f3, knight to d7, bishop to e2, just developing, you'll then castle, you'll play pawn to d4 in the future, and I think you have very good chances in this position. Their only other option here, other than capturing or what I have said so far, is pawn to f6, but this is not a very good option because now these light squares are very weak, and you actually have a couple of good options here. The engine suggests pawn to a3, just defend this and you have a small advantage. You can also try pawn to b5, pushing up and really making black have this knight be very annoying. You also have one other option here, which is pawn to e4. This is the Tartakower Gambit, because you are gambiting this pawn, but after they capture, now bishop to c4, and for the price of one pawn, this bishop is really powerful, controlling these very weak light squares, and now black is going to have a very difficult time castling, and this is another pretty strong option if you are a gambit guy. So, those are the other options, but now let's get into the main line. They capture, we capture here. We are threatening our bishop to come into g7, so because of that, their best move is knight to f6, developing a piece as well as preventing that threat. And now here you have a couple of pretty good options. However, the one that seemed to be the best here is pawn to c4, taking that queenside space, making this pawn to d5 move a little more difficult for them to play. And most people here, after like castles and pawn to e3, most people play knight to c6, which is actually not a very good move because you want your c-pawn to actually push up. So after we back up to b2, we can play it in the exact same way, and we are slightly better here because of that. Instead, the best move here, and I will show you the absolute best line for them because I'm not going to lie to you, is pawn to d5, striking in the center immediately, and you do not want to capture, you simply want to develop. Knight to f3, and once again, if black goes knight to c6 here, that is not very good for them because they want to push their c-pawn up, which they do here. Pawn to c5 is the absolute best option. Now pawn to a3, the engine here is just kind of wonky, but don't listen to it that much. Pawn to a3 is the best move here. Attack the bishop, it will back up to a5. And then you want to actually trade here, which, keep in mind, is one of the few situations where you do want to make this trade. If they capture the queen, then now we just simply capture the knight, and their pawn structure is messed up. So because of that, capturing the knight is a much better option. Then queen to c2 here is the best move. This is the golden square for your queen. Knight to c6, attacking, we simply back it up, back up to bishop b2, bishop g4, attacking this, simply bishop to e2, just develop, don't get stressed. Queen e7, castles. Yeah, engine says black is slightly better, but from a human perspective, that is not really felt at all. And what are your assets here? You have both the open, or I should say semi-open, B and C files. So what we're going to try and do is get this knight out, either to c3 and go for a big trade here, or also d3 or d4 in the future, and then going knight to d2 is not a bad option either. Then you want to try and get your rooks onto both of these semi-open files, and from there you shouldn't have too bad of a time. This is the absolute best line, and black does have a very small advantage here, but I don't think you have a bad position by any means, and I think you have good chances. So those are all of the pawn to e5 lines. Now let's get into the other ones. First off, pawn to d5, and there are three variations here that are more or less the same. They will almost always transpose into each other, and those are pawn to d5, pawn to e6, and also knight to f6. These are the three musketeers, and most of the time they will transpose their setups into each other. I'll show you what to do if they don't. And for sake of clarity, I think actually showing pawn to e6 first will be the best plan. Now simply put your bishop on b2. And something to keep in mind here is this is not a gambit of a pawn, because if they capture, this guy hangs. Capture, win the rook in the corner, you're completely winning here. So because of that, keep in mind that for some time here, they cannot capture. Instead, a better move for them is to play knight to f6. Now our bishop no longer sees that, so this is actually hanging. And here the engine suggests pawn to a3 here and just defend. However, an option I like more is pushing up to b5. Now first, if they play pawn to d5 here, this transposes into the other line with pawn to d5 first that I will show you in just a moment. But first, there is one kind of original line here, which is pawn to a6 immediately. This is so-called the queenside defense. If they do this, then you want to go into the rook exchange line. You want to go pawn to a4. If there is a pawn on b5 already, you always want to defend it with another pawn. If they ever capture, you want to capture back with another pawn, either with the a pawn in this case or also the c pawn sometimes. Like captures, you capture back, big rook exchange line. And after this, we have traded the rooks, but I do not think you have a bad position here. We once again have that very nice advance to b pawn. And after something like bishop to e7, pawn to e3, castles, and c4 here, we can basically play this in the exact same way as we normally would, and trading rooks is by no means bad for us. Now I'll look at the other line, which is pawn to d5 first. If they play this, then once again, bishop to b2. This happens like pretty much every single time. Pawn to e6 is the main move here, opening up the bishop to see this. Also show you what to do if they move the bishop out first in the knight to f6 line, but pawn to e6 is the main move here, opening up the bishop to see this. But once again, that is not a real threat, because then you would capture on g7, and I mean, yeah, you would just simply be winning here. So because that, pawn to e3, not defending, knight to f6, now this threat is no longer here. And now that the pawn is actually under attack, you want to play pawn up to b5 here once again. I mean, you know, engine suggests a3, but I like b5. And this will usually go something like bishop to d6. Now we go c4 here. Castles, knight to f3. I find it really hard to say you have a bad position here despite what the engine says. Go bishop to e2. Castle, you have a big queenside space advantage with this very nice advanced b pawn, and I think black is having kind of an annoying time here, despite the fact that objectively they are a little better. Their only other line here, other than that, is after knight to f6 first. Like I said, these three moves are kind of the three musketeers, all very much one and the same. Bishop to b2, pawn to d5 is best for them now. And after e3, once again, they can go pawn to e6 first, and after pawn to b5, this transposes into the other line. However, if they try bishop to f5 first, and try to play this in kind of a London-esque setup, then now you have a very nice pawn to c4 here. Once again, if they capture, you simply capture back the bishop. That's good for you. So instead, pawn to e6 here, and now this pawn is under attack. You simply want to play pawn to a3, defending. Once again, you can go pawn to b5 here. Either are good options. I'll show this line. Knight to d7 here, knight to f3, and once again, we can follow basically the same plan. Go bishop to e2, castle, develop your knight to c3, go for an eventual pawn to d4 break. You have a good position. Now there are two more defenses that are actually kind of unique. The first one is pawn to g6, and playing this in a King's Indian setup, we want to go bishop to b2 here. They play knight to f6, don't want to lose their rook, and also this opening can be gotten by the opposite move order with the knight first and then the pawn, there's no difference. And here you want to go pawn to c4. Black does not take the center, so you take it instead. Bishop to g7, now pawn to e3. Once again, we're playing this in basically the same way. Castles, knight to f3, pawn to d6. I mean, black is playing this in a King's Indian setup. It's actually called the King's Indian defense, quite literally. Bishop to e2 here, and now pawn to e5 is objectively their best option. And yes, our bishop no longer sees anything, but neither does their bishop, so it's fine. Castles here, a5. Remember what I said, never capture, always push up to b5. And the engine says about equal, and I would agree with that as well. Once again, go for this d4 break. Good position. I can't really say you have too many problems here. And the only other line for them that is actually unique is pawn to c6. And this doesn't look that unique at first, but the idea is you are now preventing this pawn up to b5 immediately, and their queen is going to come out to b6 with a5 as well, and this can get a bit tricky. Bishop to b2 here. Once again, nothing changes, and they have two distinct lines here, those being queen to b6 and pawn to a5. I'll show queen to b6 first, and here you do have to be a little careful. They're attacking your pawn, and you simply want to defend it, pawn to a3, but now they try pawn to a5 here. Attacking this, and normally we would push up, but then they would simply capture, and here, I mean, last resort, capture them, but we can't even do that either, because then we will lose the bishop. So here you have to resort to tactical defense with a very nice pawn to c4 here. The idea is that after they capture, now we push up to c5, and they actually cannot capture this pawn. If they do, then we simply capture here, and they're losing because we attack their queen and we attack their rook like this, and they cannot defend both pieces, so they lose. Instead, what is better here is to back up to c7. Now you simply capture on b4. We will get this trade, and like I said before, this is by no means a bad position. It is a little unique because you have your c pawn pushed instead of your b pawn, but this is not a massive difference, and it is definitely not bad for you. The only other line they can try that is a little more legitimate is an immediate pawn to a5 here, and white has a very negative score here, meaning they lose more games than they win. However, that is until one variation here, which is pawn up to b5. This is actually a very rare gambit that I think only had 300 or so games played in it at all. The idea is that after they capture, we now go pawn to e4. This is called the Schühler Gambit, and even though you are down a pawn here, it is about equal because black has these very weak pawns, and they actually have to be a bit careful here. Queen to b6 is a very common option to defend the pawn. However, after knight to c3, you can be almost completely winning here. You attack the pawn once again, and if they push up to b4, they should just sacrifice the pawn. Then now you hop into d5, and this is getting very bad for them. You attack the queen, you attack this fork here. If they back up to d8, which is the most common move, then bishop to d4. Bing, you are winning because your bishop is now going to come in, potentially trap the queen like pawn to e6, a bishop to b6 here. Queen is probably just forced to move, but now you get this fork, you win the rook, you are completely winning. So because of that, their only really good option here is to play pawn to b4 immediately instead of queen to b6, at which point you want to go pawn to a3. You're going to get this trade where you capture back with the knight, and you are down a pawn here. However, you have two more pieces developed, and after like a knight to c6 here, you can play pawn to d4 and take a massive center. Engine says white is only a little bit better. However, I think you have fantastic chances in this position. Alright, thank you so much for watching and learning about the Polish opening. I have been your teacher today. Thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe, do that stuff. Check out other videos in my opening series, and I will see you next time. Have a fantastic day.